This first question I'm going to direct at Mick, but it's open to everyone. So we have a new irregular warfare strategy document, DoD Instruction 300.07, right? A truly vibrant and awe-inspiring name. But I'm sure there are all sorts of implications tied to the new U.S. government publication. But before we actually get into the meat of the new policy, I'd first just like to ask, why is it important for the U.S. to have a guiding irregular warfare strategic document at all?
Well, Ben, I think it's a great question. I think it's really the question of the day. I would quibble just a bit on the front end. It is a policy document. There is nothing really strategic about it, right? It is not providing end states. It's not providing specific goals. It's providing a policy statement about what the department thinks is important. And I think that is why this policy statement is so incredibly important at this time. The last one, I think, came out in 2014. And then taking a look at when it was originally communicated around irregular warfare is really framed by the entirety of the GWOT era, focused on counterinsurgency and foreign internal defense. Certainly with the shift to strategic competition and near-peer competition with adversaries, the ability to understand irregular warfare in that construct is an incredible step for the department. And I think the biggest thing, and we'll talk about this as we move forward, is flagging that this is not just a special operations requirement. The entirety of the joint force is necessary for irregular warfare to be effective, primarily because for such a long time, the DoD community as an enterprise really looked at the special forces community, and I mean the special forces community only, not SOF writ large, as the executors of irregular warfare. And I think that's a place that left us at a pretty good disadvantage. I think right now we are very far behind, but this statement at this time is something that I had hoped as really the primary team responsible for this in the Pentagon to launch us into having these discussions and helping to determine what this actually means for the department.
Yeah, so I'd like to riff off of Trotsky and say why this is important. America may not be interested in irregular warfare, but irregular warfare is interested in America. And so we've got to understand this form of conflict, this form of warfare. And I would say, to really add to what Mick is saying, back when we did the first 3000.7 in 2007, back then we looked at a lot of doctrine, one being foreign internal defense. And we looked at that as special forces only. But if you read the doctrine, you would see that it applies to the entire joint force. But because it was primarily perceived to be executed by special forces, people ignored the doctrine. And and that's of course how we grew security force assistance and these other things. And, we had just a proliferation of doctrinal growth. And one of the things that this is doing, like the 2007, identifying the primary activities, unconventional warfare, foreign internal defense, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, stability operations, and military information support operations, this really starts to clarify the policy, which is very necessary to do. But of course, there are some real challenges with it that we'll talk about.
I think it's important to have it because most people don't inherently understand what irregular warfare is. I think that's true both popularly, and I would say that's also true across the department. And so having a document that says, this is what it is, here's what it means, here's what it looks like, and here's how we intend to do it is really important, especially given as my colleagues have said, the changing trends in the definitions of irregular warfare and the terminology and our understanding of it has evolved considerably over the last several decades. So I think it's important in that regard as well.
Yeah, Ben, if I could, I'll just add one thing onto that. And I think that this podcast is very emblematic of what we had hoped to achieve when we wrote the document. And for transparency, I left the department in May of this year, but my team was responsible for the drafting of this policy document. Since this document dropped very quickly, I'll add, at the end of September, right before the shutdown, but I would say there's been articles in very well-read journals. There's been other communications taking a level of analysis, some of which I quibble with, and I'll talk about that. But again, I think the purpose was to drive discussion because I think there's a tremendous need to educate not only those internal to the department, but also our interagency colleagues, because they have a role to play, but it's not in irregular warfare. It's under a much broader political banner, the political warfare banner that Dave likes to talk about so much, but it is a whole of government approach. And I would argue that irregular warfare is the Department of Defense's contribution to that political warfare approach as it relates to the whole of government.
And I would just add, Mick saying, quibbling about the definition is really key. But I would say that as long as we're quibbling about it, it's helping us to understand. This is inherently complex. It's difficult to communicate, but the quibbling is actually really what advances our thinking. And so I will say something here that's probably controversial. I don't really care about the definition. I just accept whatever definition we're using. I want to get into really understanding the phenomena and then developing the strategy, the national strategy, military strategy to deal with the threats to America that emanate from irregular warfare, countries practicing irregular warfare or non-state actors practicing it around the world.